And joining me now, Caitlin Huey-Burns. She's a CBSN political contributor and reporter for Real Clear Politics. Okay, so we heard Paula sort of break down the legal component to it all. But, you know, what surprises me is how many people on Capitol Hill, Democrats, are not pushing for impeachment. And even Paula said impeachment is sort of premature at this point.
Right, exactly. I think that's very telling about where we are right now. Remember, Democrats, the base of the Democratic Party is kind of driving towards that or talking about it. But many candidates are not. They're trying to steer the conversation away from that because they know that Republicans are using the specter of impeachment in their own campaigns. They're trying to target kind of soft Republican voters, independent voters who don't really have an appetite for partisan fights or for the next couple of years being entrenched in these impeachment proceedings, trying to target those voters and saying, look, you may not like everything Donald Trump is doing right now, but do you want the next couple of years to look like that? That's why Republicans are going to be talking a lot about impeachment. Democrats are walking a much more taking a much more cautious approach because they don't want to necessarily run on that. And also, as you mentioned, and as Paula has been reporting, this is ongoing. There's still the continuing trial for Manafort, of course. There is a big question about what Mueller actually has, what he could produce, what kind of surprises could come. And that's what has a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill very anxious about what could possibly come next, what other shoes are going to drop.
Do you get the sense that this Russia-Mueller probe has a big impact on how voters, particularly his base, let's look at it just his base right now. I mean, are they concerned about this?
They're not really concerned about this. We've seen in the polling that the approach to the Mueller investigation has broken down really on partisan lines. We've seen Republicans increasingly responding that this is a witch hunt, as the president has described it. You see a lot of Republican candidates kind of echoing that line. Of course, you have a lot of Democrats arguing the exact opposite, saying, look, there have been over 24 indictments from this. And of course, yesterday's news is the manifestation, the first real consequence of that. And so there are a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill right now who are saying that, look, this is not about collusion at this point, and they're kind of drawing their lines in the sand on the issue of collusion. However, behind the scenes, there is this anxiety that Republicans have that this could be extremely damaging for the president, extremely damaging for the party. And at the same time, you have Democrats who are waging a campaign against corruption. We heard from Elizabeth Warren yesterday. Several months ago, I was reporting about Democratic efforts to make anti-corruption a big part of their midterm campaigns. Yesterday's news certainly feeds into that.
You know, the White House is now trying to paint Cohen as someone who's just not credible and taking a dig at his credibility. Here's what Senator Byrd had to say about Cohen's own testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee.
We recently re-engaged Mr. Cohen and his team following press reports that suggested he had advanced knowledge of a June 16th meeting between campaign officials and a Russian lawyer at the Trump Tower. Mr. Cohen had testified before the committee that he was not aware of any meeting prior to this disclosure in the press last summer. As such, the committee inquired of Mr. Cohen's legal team as to whether Mr. Cohen stood by his testimony. They responded that he did stand by his testimony. We hope that today's developments in Mr. Cohen's plea agreement will not preclude him from an appearance before our committee as needed for ongoing investigation.
So you heard Byrd right there. He says Senate Intel Committee might want to hear from him again. The back and forth with the White House trying to discredit him. Does that help or hurt at this point?
Right. It's really interesting and important to consider that while we have the Mueller investigation going on, we also have congressional oversight going on here, particularly in the Senate, which has been seen as a bipartisan approach to this whole entire thing. So, of course, there are so many questions lingering about what Cohen knows, what he has said, whether, in fact, he will cooperate with the special counsel probe, and what exactly comes from this plea agreement. As much as the White House wants to discredit Cohen, and there certainly are grounds for that, at the end of the day, he has been the president's lawyer and fixer, as we've described him, for many, many years. This is someone who was close to the president before all of this, of course, close to the campaign. There are many questions about him and what could come of this.
You know, and it's wasn't that long ago, 1999, when we were talking about Bill Clinton and impeachment. In fact, I want to play a soundbite from you from Senator Lindsey Graham talking about impeachment, and this was during President Bill Clinton's Senate trial in 1999.
Because impeachment is not about punishment. Impeachment is about cleansing the office. Impeachment is about restoring honor and integrity to the office.
You know, you're hearing that, but at the same time, you know, you're hearing the calls not to go into impeachment. I mean, you can't, there's talk about whether or not you can indict a sitting president at this point, but removing them for office is about impeachment at this point. So you know, he also said yesterday, looking into partisan, that this is going to become a partisan divide.
Right. It's so fascinating because there are several lawmakers still on Capitol Hill who were involved in those impeachment proceedings several years ago. So they are facing this idea that they are on tape, they are on record with these kinds of sentiments, and they're going to be asked why apply that rule then and not now. So Republicans are faced with a very difficult situation here, especially since we're only a couple of months from the midterm. They want to kind of maintain some level of calmness heading into the midterms, trying to make their own case for governing, all the while this in the backdrop certainly hovering over everything, not only this, but also their own words.
You know, do you think, you look at the reality on the ground ahead of midterms with Republicans, many people know you side with the president. They've gotten a bump. I mean, we look in Wyoming, there was he backed a candidate, didn't quite work out. There are these dotted moments. But at the same time, I mean, can a Republican member of Congress have a moment of courage and come out against the president the way the Democrats are in crossing the aisle at this point?
I don't think we're going to see a lot of that. I mean, look at West Virginia last night where the president held his rally. The Republican candidate for the Senate there, who is challenging longtime Democrat and an incumbent Senator Joe Manchin in a state where Trump is extremely popular. That campaign was promoting all of the headlines about the president coming in and campaigning for that Republican candidate. So in a state like that, Republicans are going to endear themselves to Trump, get as close to him as possible. But there is this question about the president's national approval rating hovering around 40-something%, what that means for districts in Florida, New York, here in New York, of course, California, others that are swing districts held by Republicans who are very anxious about what this all means in terms of their own election prospects. You're going to see them try to distance themselves from this, and I'm really interested to see how they handle this.
You know, on the same day we had Manafort and Cohen convictions, we also across the way Duncan Hunter indicted. You were talking about sort of the approach the Democrats had about going after sort of finances. Also, there was just 2 weeks ago, Congressman Chris Coons. So does this help the Democrats' case? Chris Collins. Do you think that that builds their case of going forward and the corruption issues?
It's fascinating that the Duncan Hunter news was, you know, at the bottom of headlines yesterday, just given all of the news that was coming out yesterday. That is a serious charge, and the indictment really paints a corrupt picture of a politician here. Interestingly enough, Duncan Hunter and Chris Collins were the first two members of Congress to endorse this president. Of course, this is a president who campaigned against draining the swamp, and you can argue this activity is very, very swampy. And so this certainly fits into the argument that Democrats have been trying to wage, and something they waged in 2006 when they eventually took over the House, that this is a culture of corruption, they're calling it, trying to tie every Republican to this president and to the president's kind of inner circle and the people he surrounds himself with. So certainly this gives them even more fodder and actual, you know, this saying that this extends beyond Trump.
And then we're also seeing Democrats coming forward saying, we don't want to talk about Kavanaugh. We don't want to talk about this. If they've got a co-conspirator, why give this president an opportunity to select somebody else as a Supreme Court justice?
Right, exactly. What's fascinating is that that is all happening in the backdrop here, too, that the president does have this real big opportunity with this Supreme Court justice, something that many voters on his side, on the Republican side, have been angling for years. That this, of course, everything is hovering over this as well. I don't anticipate that that's going to get a lot of traction with Republicans. You do have a section of Democrats who are clamoring for this. Mazie Hirono kind of leading the charge here. You also have several Democrats up for re-election in states that Donald Trump won overwhelmingly, who are more inclined to cross the aisle at some points. There are big question marks about whether they will do so with this nominee. I don't think you're going to see them joining with Democrats on this. this.
And many people believe it's a bigger motivator on the Republican side.
Absolutely.
The Supreme
in terms
Court
of votes.
pick, very
right.
big.
Yeah.
Well, Caitlin Huey-Burns, grateful you could join us on set
Thank
to
you
break
so
it all
much.
down.
Good to see you.